All right, hey guys, welcome. This is the Chapter 7 video, so welcome to week 3 of the class. The server's down at school, so I'm working from home today, recording this on my laptop, so I hope it works okay. It's my first time doing this. But we are on now to Chapter 7, which talks about how we measure total output and total income, which really kind of measures of the overall size of the economy. So a couple chapters ago, we talked quite a bit about GDP, gross domestic product. We had a definition there where we talked about the definition and broke that down quite a bit. But to be more specific, in this chapter, we'll look at how the government actually tries to estimate GDP. So essentially, there are a couple ways of doing it. The most common way that they do it is to use this, what's called the total spending approach. So they basically look at who spends money in the economy and try to estimate the total amount of spending. So basically that comes down to 4 groups. So C in this equation is consumption. So that's personal consumption by households for final goods and services. I is investment. That's not really investment, probably like you're used to thinking of it. This is investment. It's mostly referring to business investment for capital expenditures, but also, as you can see there, new housing stock counts in investment, and changes in inventory businesses hold. G is government purchases. So notice that's not government spending. That's an important difference. Not all government spending consists of a purchase. So the only thing that's included in G is when the government purchases a final good or service. So if they buy equipment for the military or uniforms for the military, or they pay people's salary. When they pay my salary, for example, I'm a government employee, the salaries of government employees and purchases of actual things the government will use, those count. Very importantly, though, G excludes things called transfer payments. So those are things like welfare, Social Security payments, unemployment, pensions to retired government employees and military personnel. Those things aren't counted because essentially one way to think of it is the government's not actually purchasing anything there. They're just giving money to certain groups of people. Those people will then go out and spend that money and purchase final goods and services. So we'd be double counting if we counted those things. And then last, X sub N is net exports. So exports minus imports. So when Americans buy imports, that's money leaving the country. We have to subtract that from GDP. When we sell exports to other people in other countries, that's money coming in, so that gets added. So basically, that's how we estimate GDP. You've seen this image before, but this is the circular flow, and it shows the flow of, let's see here, I gotta look at it for a second. The flow of money on the outside. So there's factor incomes coming from firms to households, spending for personal consumption going from households to firms. So the outer circle is the flow of money. The inner circle is the actual flow of goods and services and factors of production. I'll come back to that point in a second. Just to give you a quick idea, here are roughly the size of those different parts of GDP. So C plus I plus G plus XN. Consumption is by far the biggest part, followed by the G and then the I. And as much as it's talked about, we have a net export sector that's negative. So we have a trade deficit right now. So there's how our GDP is actually broken up. This chapter talked a little bit about value added. So that's another way of estimating total output or total income. And the idea behind value added is instead of looking just at the final goods and services, you look at each step along the way. So if you follow along that first row, assume that a fisherman in Maine catches some live Maine lobster and sells it to Maine Shellfish for $5,000. Now, obviously, in the real world, that fisherman has a lot of expenses and things, but let's just assume there are no expenses. The fisherman just plucked the lobsters right out of the ocean. So by catching them and selling them to Maine Shellfish, the lobsterman has added $5,000 worth of value into the economy. Now, let's say Maine Shellfish pays some employees to pick the lobster meat. They sell that lobster meat to a seafood restaurant in Florida for $8,000. So now Maine Shellfish has taken something that was worth $5,000, transformed it into something that's worth $8,000. So the value added at that step is $3,000. Now, let's say the restaurant in Florida sells fancy Maine lobster tail dinners to tourists for a total of $15,000. So they've taken something that was worth $8,000, transformed it into something worth $15,000. So the value added is $7,000. So if you add up those three numbers in the right column, you get a total value added of $15,000. And you'll notice that's exactly the same as the price of the final product, the Maine lobster dinner sold to restaurants. So in chapter 5, I think it was, when we talked about GDP the first time, we said that it counts only final goods and services. So under that definition, we would have just looked at the value of the Maine lobster dinner. But at other times, in other agencies and things, sometimes they'll estimate the same statistics using value added. Just as a little side note, value added is not that important, but there are a lot of, or it's not talked about a lot. There's more and more talk about what's called a value added tax. A lot of countries around the world use value added taxes where instead of having a sales tax like we have in the United States, that's just on the final goods and services, they would tax each of these steps along the way. And it kind of, I don't know, it has the same effect in the end, but it kind of spreads the taxes around a little bit more. I don't know, it's an interesting idea. I've mentioned before that if anybody wants to come up with your own critical thinking paper topic, you could do it. This would be a great one. If you wanted to research value added tax versus sales tax, what do you think of the pros and cons? Should we change to a value added tax or something like that? That would be a good one. Okay, really quickly, I'll trust you to read this. It's not too hard, but gross domestic product and gross national product. We used to talk a lot more about GNP. We're starting to switch and talk about GDP more because that's what the rest of the world does. Basically, the difference is GDP counts something if it's literally produced in a country. GNP counts things that are produced by a country's residents. So, for example, if you have a Madawaska resident up in northern Maine who works at a paper mill in New Brunswick, this is very common, and they earn a salary of $15,000 or $55,000, whose GDP does that increase? Well, because it's produced in Canada, that would get added into Canada's GDP. But what about GNP? Because it's an American resident working somewhere else, that would count in the US's GNP. So that's the reason those numbers are a little bit different. In the end, they come out to be pretty close to the same in most cases, but that's the difference. Okay. This chapter also talked a bit about gross domestic income. So that's another measure of the size of the economy or the size of that circular flow. If you remember back to this table, gross domestic income would look at all those income figures on the right and see a total income of $15,000. Gross domestic product would look at the value of the final good or service, which was also $15,000. So in theory, these two things are the same. Basically, GDP is output, GDI is income. Every dollar's worth of output that gets sold becomes income to someone. So these two numbers should be the same. In reality, they're measured by different samples, by different agencies and different statistical sampling techniques. So they might be a little bit off, but basically these things are pretty much the same. All right, so I'm not going to read all this to you. Here are the components of GDI, basically all the different sources of income out there in the economy. We'll leave it at that. Okay, this is one of the possible critical thinking paper topics or relates to it, but there are some conceptual problems with GDP. A lot of people think GDP measures well-being, so that a country with a higher GDP must be richer and better off than a country without one. But we talked a little bit about this a couple chapters ago, but that's really not fair. A lot of economic goods, a lot of really good productive things are undervalued, such as the value of cooking at home, growing gardens, do-it-yourself projects, stay-at-home parenting, volunteer work, those kinds of things. There are a lot of things in the underground economy that you could argue maybe offer positive, valuable